Folks, I'm Doug Page, and joining me today is Mark Clifford, a former reporter and editor with many years of living in and covering Hong Kong. The island and its nearby territories were, for more than 150 years, ruled by Great Britain. In 1997, the British returned Hong Kong to Chinese rule, and that meant to the People's Republic of China the government in Beijing. Since that time, especially in the last few years, it's become ground zero in the debate between about what is a better way to govern, with near autocratic rule and limits on civil rights as Beijing demands, or as the Western world sees it, allowing its citizens freedom of expression and nearly unlimited civil rights. Today, Mr. Clifford resides in the United States and is president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, which seeks political freedom for citizens and those living in Hong Kong. And one of the reasons that Mr. Clifford is here today is because he authored a book about 2 years ago entitled Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World. In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years while growing up. At the time, my dad ran United Press International's Asia Pacific Division. Mr. Clifford, thank you for being here today.
Great. Well, thank you for your interest in Hong Kong.
Appreciate it. Here's my first question. Hong Kong and the territories associated with the former British colony consists of nearly 430 square miles and about 7.4 million people. Given its size, why should anyone in the United States and the Western world care about how Beijing rules Hong Kong?
That's a great question, but I think that Hong Kong was one of the freest places in the world, both economically and in some senses politically, for over 100 years. And as goes Hong Kong, I worry goes much of the rest of the world. And if Beijing is able to impose its will on Hong Kong and destroy freedoms there with no real opposition from the rest of the world, then it'll be Taiwan next. And after that, who knows? I mean, Korea, Japan, the Philippines are all looking warily at China's increasing assertiveness, aggressiveness, and willingness to try to stifle free speech. And I should say it doesn't just end in the Pacific. I'm seeing colleagues here, Chinese and Hong Kong colleagues here in the United States, in London, where we also have an office, throughout the United Kingdom and Ireland, in Europe, also under pressure. I have a colleague who has a $130,000 bounty on her head. She's living in the States. She has asylum. Her parents have been detained in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government says they will hunt her and others down like street rats for the rest of their lives. So I think there's a pretty good reason to be concerned that what started in Hong Kong is not going to end with Hong Kong.
And you talk about the $130,000 bounty. This is a bounty being provided by the government in Beijing?
The government in Hong Kong for the arrest and prosecution of 13 different overseas activists. $1 million Hong Kong dollars for each one of them.
And how many are they seeking?
13 people is what they're looking for. Yeah. And they're all living in Australia, the US, or England, Great Britain.
So 13 million Hong Kong dollars total is what they're prepared to pay out? Yeah.
And more importantly, 13 individuals and their families in Hong Kong and around the world are being harassed. I'd say simply because they were trying to exercise their political rights. None of them have been accused of any violent crime. Several of them are former legislators, in fact. It's really outrageous, but I don't think Beijing or its minions in Hong Kong actually respect freedom, even in free countries like the United States and Canada, Australia, the UK. It's really worrying.
There have been stories about the Hong Kong police or the Chinese police having offices in New York. Are you aware of those?
Yeah, they had a secret police station down in Chinatown. It was run under the auspices, I think, of a local Chinese association, and not quite clear what went on there, but it was a way of them exercising their influence in the States, particularly over Chinese people,
Gotcha.
Ethnically Chinese people.
The people or the person living in the United States who's got the bounty on her head, how does she get around here without them knocking on her door? I mean, is she living incognito under an alias? What is she doing?
Well, I have to thank, and I think she would thank the U.S. authorities, the FBI and others who've helped her out and let it be known to the Chinese authorities and others not to mess around with her. And I think that those of the 13 who are living in the U.S. feel pretty good. The U.S. has stood up and made it really clear to the Chinese not to mess around with them on U.S. soil. I'm not sure that the people living in Great Britain and Australia feel that they've gotten the same kind of support from their host governments.
Gotcha. And when you talk about Chinese students here in the United States being, I guess, coerced in some way or another, what exactly is going on there? I do know you did mention this in your book, so can you just go into some detail
Yeah,
about that?
sure. I mean, look, China is a extremely strong and powerful government, and it's done a lot on the economic side. I'd say mostly by kind of letting the the I don't know, entrepreneurialism of the China, the hard, diligent work ethic of many Chinese people free. But it's a very strong, assertive state, and they've used what they call a united front strategy, where they have a variety of different organizations which don't necessarily look like official organizations that monitor students and use other students to monitor other students, sometimes with monetary inducements, but more likely with a promise that their careers will benefit, or their families back home will be helped or hurt if they don't play ball. And it's a level of control over the individual that only a totalitarian government could or would even think of exercise. And it's something that's so alien to us as Americans. We can't quite get our heads around the fact that Chinese students who are studying engineering or politics or whatever at U.S. universities aren't free. They aren't free to go to meetings and seminars, let alone to speak out, but even to go to events. And that's, again, I think it's something it's hard for us to get our heads around as Americans.
Sure. Let's just talk about the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. How long has your organization been around, and what are you guys trying to do?
Yeah, the technical name actually has foundation at the end, Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. And we were set up about a year and a half ago, had a precursor organization a couple of years before that. We're focused above all on trying to get political prisoners out of jail in Hong Kong. There are, according to the Hong Kong Democracy Council, which tracks this, about 1,800 political prisoners in Hong Kong. And some of them I know. I was on the board of directors of the company that published the main pro-democracy newspaper, AppleDaily. 7 of my colleagues are in jail, and they're in jail just for practicing journalism. And one of them, JimmyLai, who is the chairman and owns 70% of the company, is on trial right now for something that could see him put away for life. He is being tried under the national security law, which has a 100% conviction rate. He's a 75-year-old man who is being held in solitary confinement. He's been in jail for over 3 years, and he doesn't deserve to be in jail. So a group of us who lived in Hong Kong for the most part, chaired by the former U.S. Consul General in Hong Kong, Ambassador James Cunningham, founded this organization to try to give a voice to the Hong Kong people at a time when the political situation back in their home made it impossible. And we think that the freedoms that they're in jail for are not indictable offenses. They should be free. And we're using every way we can to put pressure on our governments and on the Hong Kong and Chinese governments to live up to the promises they made to the people of Hong Kong when China took over, as you said, in 1997 from Britain. China promised that Hong Kong people would be able to enjoy their own way of life. They'd have freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, all the freedoms that you and I have, and then some. They were going to get the right to have universal suffrage, to elect their own mayor, their own city council, and it hasn't worked out that way. And I think the lies that the Chinese government have told about Hong Kong and the crackdown that they've engendered has been, a real tragedy, for our friends in Hong Kong, where I lived for 28 years. But really, as I said, for the world, there's a lot at stake here, and obviously, Taiwan is the main focus in terms of the next place where we're afraid China might move.
Sure. How is your group being funded?
We have private donations. We don't have any government funding.
Oh, private donations. Okay. What sort of impact is your organization having?
Well, it's always hard to measure. I mean, I always remind people we'd love to be out of a job, but we need to get people out of prison before we can be out of a job. And we're not doing a very good job at that so far. In fact, things are moving the wrong direction. On the other hand, we have a tremendous amount of support in Washington, in London, and we get regularly attacked by the Hong Kong government. So, you take that as you would. I guess that's a kind of backhanded compliment.
Do you have people on the ground in Hong Kong who can talk to the government at all?
Impossible. Impossible. I mean, again, people like my colleague Frances Hoy are here. She has asylum in here, and the government is pursuing her with this 1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty. So most of the people we work with would be at risk of arrest in Hong Kong. And I certainly would be afraid to go back. The company that I was on the board of, Next Digital, all the directors ended up in jail. For a time, I was the only director not in custody in Hong Kong. And so it's not a very comfortable position when you have governments that want to lock you up just because they don't like what you're saying.
So if you were to fly back to Hong Kong today, would you be arrested at the airport?
Well, I can't say what they would do, but I don't know. I mean, maybe if I were lucky, they wouldn't let me in, but it's not a chance that I'd want to take, not for myself as much as just for the trouble I think it would cause other people. I don't think, then, people like the U.S. State Department would have to worry about me. They have enough to worry about. So.
Gotcha. You mentioned the national security law briefly a few moments ago. Can you shed some light on what this law means for the people in Hong Kong? And then I saw a story today too as well, and I'm sure you've seen them too, that this national security law is also seen to be causing problems with the business community in Hong Kong too as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's several things. First of all, I don't want to make light about your previous question about whether or not I'd be locked up. I have no idea, but given the fact that
I
they're
didn't take it that
locking,
way at all.
Given the fact that many people I know and worked with are in jail, including 7 of my former colleagues, I wouldn't risk it. But I can't say what the Hong Kong government would do. The national security law is a vague and sweeping law that came out just about 4 years ago at the end of June 2020. And it essentially criminalizes dissent. People have been tried. Well, right now, Jimmy Lai, who's the newspaper owner that I mentioned, is being tried on collusion with foreign forces. It's a lengthy trial, and there's a lot of smoke. And all it seems to show is that he was a guy who owned a newspaper, who really believed in democracy, and was willing to put his money where his mouth was, and was practicing journalism, and they want to lock him up for the rest of his life. He's got 6 other colleagues, as I said, who are in jail. And they've all pled guilty, but they're being held hostage while he's being tried. So, I mean, that's an example of the kinds of things that people are being thrown in jail for the national security law. Basically, whenever the government doesn't like you and you're effective, you're a target of the national security law. Jimmy Lai is being held, as I said, in solitary confinement. So we don't actually know what the specific offenses always are. His offense seems to have been that he met with U.S. officials like Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton. Obviously, all those are the titles at the time, not now, and called for sanctions against Hong Kong and Chinese officials and warned that a political crackdown was coming in Hong Kong. Well, he seems to have been right about the political crackdown, and for that, he's in jail, right? So there are scores of other people in jail on these national security law charges. And I think what you might have been referring to in terms of the concern on the business community is a new kind of parallel or companion law under Article 23 of the mini constitution that governs Hong Kong. Sorry to get so technical on this, just passed today, a few hours ago. Today is March 19th. I don't know if you want to edit that out or anything. Sorry if it's too time sensitive, but yeah, and so that really has people concerned because it seems to broaden the number of offenses for what's already a vague catch-all of like opposing the government. People have been jailed for holding up blank pieces of paper, for having posters, for singing songs. The government has asked Google and others and YouTube to take down songs that they don't like. So Stuff that you and I would regard as the most innocuous form of political participation, hardly worthy of mention, let alone arrest, is something that they're throwing people in jail for lengthy terms. So, quite rightly, foreign business wonders, if it's Jimmy Lai today, is it going to be me tomorrow? I mean, where does this stop? And nobody knows. And unfortunately, under this new Article 23 law, the boundary between acceptable behavior and behavior that's going to end with you in jail is become further blurred.
Right.
And if I can add, you did ask about the business community. I think it's really important to remember that Hong Kong was one of the great business centers of the world. It was the financial capital of Asia, and it's kind of going nowhere economically. I just looked recently at the Hang Seng Index, which is kind of like the Standard and Poor's for Hong Kong. In January, it was basically right where it was when the British left in the middle of 1997. It's gone up a little bit since then. So basically, stocks have flatlined over a period of more than 25 years, while the S&P in the U.S. has gone up more than 9 times. If you put $100 into the S&P, you'd have close to $1,000 today. And if you put that same money to the Hang Seng Index, you just have a little more than $100, maybe $120 back. So I think in answer to your question about the business community, that tells you a lot about what has not been going right in Hong Kong.
Sure. Has there been lots of immigration out of Hong Kong?
There are several 100,000 people have left, some of the best and the brightest. A lot of expats have left, but I think, really sadly, a lot of Hong Kongers, people in their 30s and 40s, often with children, have left because they don't want their kids growing up under a communist regime where little kids are goose stepping and saluting the communist flag.
How hard is it for someone who was a native of Hong Kong to leave and immigrate somewhere else?
Thankfully, not that hard, especially to Britain. Britain has really stepped up, as the former colonial overseer, I guess, for 156 years, and they've had a special category of citizenship that makes it quite easy for people a special visa category. It makes it easy for people to go to the UK and then within, I think it's 5 years, apply for citizenship. The Hong Kong government has made it harder to leave because it won't let people take their pension savings when they take advantage of this British visa. So we've had close to 200,000 people go to Britain under that scheme, and quite a few have gone to Australia and Canada as well.
Gotcha. From my reading of your book, you mentioned that Great Britain, prior to handing over Hong Kong to Beijing, negotiated with the People's Republic over the national security law. What did those talks entail?
Yeah, they didn't really negotiate over the national security law. They negotiated over what became a treaty called the Sino-British Declaration that's lodged at the United Nations. And that did have some national security clauses in it, but it basically worked to get the Chinese to promise that they would leave Hong Kong alone for 50 years. Hong Kong could, and it still does, have its own currency, its own tax system, its own government administration. It was supposed to be able to develop its own path to democracy, and those talks included a promise by China that Hong Kong would embark on a path to universal suffrage. And although there are elections in Hong Kong, they were constrained. There wasn't direct election for the mayor, for example. That was supposed to happen. The legislative council, which is kind of city council, was also supposed to be fairer and more representative. And that hasn't happened. Quite the opposite has happened. So the talks revolved around Britain trying to guarantee or ensure that Hong Kong would remain free for 50 years. And I think, it's really quite an extraordinary promise by the Chinese. It's a shame they couldn't live up to it. But I think we all, and I've talked to British negotiators involved, we all thought China was moving in a direction of more reform and more liberalization. And we figured by the end of 50 years, China would probably be a lot more like us than like the China of the Maoist years. And sadly, that has not proven the case.
What is Great Britain's legacy in Hong Kong?
I think its legacy is what's left of a system of freedom, of fair government, fair administration, rule of law, economic liberty. To the extent legacies last for decades, there's still quite a bit of that left, and there's a aspirational sense among Hong Kongers of trying to live up to and live to these ideals. Jimmy Lai is in jail because he really believed in the what he would call Western values, but he really means the kind of values that Britain brought in terms of free economy, freedom to speak, freedom to worship. Jimmy is a devout Catholic, and as you know, actually several 100,000 people in Hong Kong are. So the Christian community in Hong Kong is very, very robust. And I think these are part of the legacy that the people in Hong Kong who like freedom, they can be Chinese. They're often very proud of being, most are very proud of being Chinese, but they want to be free Chinese, different kind of Chinese, not communist Chinese. And so it's the battle between that communist Chinese reality of today versus the legacy of the free Chinese that I think the Britain instilled, that's really at the heart of the battle.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. You talked about the fact that, many in the West, in the 1990s, certainly, were looking at China and seeing all this economic freedom go on and figured that, come 50 years of Hong Kong, they would, that China would just be more like the United States or more like the Western world that it has really become. I mean, we were all fooled, right?
Yeah, I count myself guilty. I mean, I wrote a book when China got into the WTO, China in the WTO, changing China, changing world trade, with the incoming director of the World Trade Organization, Supachai Panichpak, and we were very optimistic that more economic freedom and liberalization would lead to more political and social freedom. I'd earlier lived in South Korea, and I'd seen that transition take place. There are obviously a lot of differences between China and South Korea, it turns out in retrospect. I don't know that we were all fooled. I work with a lot of people who were very opposed to basically giving China a free pass on the WTO entry and some other issues. Yeah, I mean, I spent decades working for engagement and really believing that more trade would equal more political, social, and economic liberalization, and it hasn't worked out like that.
Sure. But in getting Hong Kong back, and I realize that, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher when she was the prime minister, had suggested to the Beijing government that, Britain continue to rule Hong Kong past 1997. Obviously, that fell flat on its face. But China basically, if I'm understanding everything I've read, had a legal right to get Hong Kong back. Am I right about that or wrong about that?
You're about 90% right. Hong Kong was taken in three tranches by the British. The first was during the first Opium War, and they signed a treaty in perpetuity. The Chinese would say it was an unequal treaty, and they didn't really regard it as valid. But from a legal standpoint, strictly narrow legal standpoint, Britain had the right to hold the island of Hong Kong forever. In the second Opium War in the 1850s, it took a little tranche of mainland China, the Kowloon Peninsula, up to Boundary Street, and that was also supposed to be in perpetuity. In 1898, they took about 90% of Hong Kong, a much bigger territory, and they signed a 99-year lease. And the end of that lease in 1997 is what prompted the Chinese to say, not only are we taking the new territories back, we're taking it all back. And Thatcher's like, no, we have the right to keep it forever. So there's, there's a little bit of argument. In fact, in practical terms, no way the British could have held out if the Chinese wanted it back. The water comes, and it still comes from China. Most of the food comes from China. I mean, this was absolutely indefensible in the case of any sort of a blockade. So, but the Chinese did not, quote, in narrow legal terms, have the right to take Hong Kong Island back. And there are people who just feel that Thatcher blinked and she wasn't tough enough. I think it's a little too facile to say.
Gotcha. I suspect what probably many don't understand, who are not experts like you and bring your level of experience, is why Hong Kong was so important for the Beijing government to take over. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, what would be a good analogy here? I mean, yeah, I suppose if I don't know, Mexico had the San Francisco Bay Area, and it had seized the San Francisco Bay Area, and was using it to pump, let's say, fentanyl sales into the U.S., which is why Hong Kong originally existed, so the British could sell opium and other goods into China. And there was a bit of a lease, so they got Marin and Sonoma counties, and the lease was up, and we said we want all of it back. I mean, it was that kind of thing. They felt that this was it really was gunboat diplomacy. Parts of their territory were taken. Actually, I think in the end, 80-something little bits of China were taken up by colonial powers and run as extraterritorial enclaves. And so when the time came to take those back, they really, really wanted it back. I mean, it symbolized humiliation, weakness, and defeat on the part of the Chinese government. And the new People's Republic of China was determined to right what they saw as a historical injustice, a historical wrong. And it was really as painful as if a bit of America had been taken by a hostile power.
Given how the Western world and parts of the world, treated China back in the 19th century, and they had all those little bits of themselves over there and occupied some of the territory of China. I mean, does this spur on the Beijing government to be superior in technology to stand up to the United States and other Western countries?
I think that's part of the spur. I think China is, unique really in being run by the same kind of unitary administrative system. The size of the territory has changed, grown dramatically, but it's pretty much been ruled by the same sort of government for a couple of thousand years. Let's say 2,000 years. At least that's how the Chinese think about it. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of change of dynasties, revolutions, etc. But so there's a long, proud cultural, administrative, governmental, and economic history. And of course, China was the largest economy in the world until the early 19th century. And then it let itself be lapped, be surpassed by little England, right? I mean, tiny little speck compared to China and this great civilization. So once they were able to kind of figure out how to catch up and obviously surpass England, I think that the the humiliations it suffered in the 19th century were a useful political spur for communist governments. It could have been a nationalist government, but it happens to have been particularly potent, I think, for the communist Chinese to use. And I think in some senses that's okay. We can all understand the pride of nationalism, the way that that's a spur. But what's troubling now is that, and this is where I emphasize the communist part, I think that there's a sense of victimhood and of injustice and the fact that we've been wronged. And yes, I mean, there were a lot of bad things about colonialism, but here we are, the better part of 200 years on, well over a century, and about 75 years since the communist Chinese took over. And they're still talking about things that happened 150 years ago and how bad it was. And I can understand that in some senses, but it's like, how can you be a victim? You're 1.4 billion people. You're the world's second largest economy. Why are you talking about it like you're the underdog and that you've been so wronged and you need to lash out at whether it's Hong Kong or Taiwan, where you have 25 million people in a democratic China, but somehow you're not going to let them exist freely. You've got to be threatening the Philippines, Vietnam, all your neighbors. It's that kind of, how do we draw the line between a legitimate nationalist spur and the sense of aggrieved victimhood that becomes very, very aggressive in a worrying sense? And unfortunately, I think in Xi Jinping's China, we've gone too far.
Gotcha. John Toland in his book, The Rising Sun, written obviously a few decades ago, suggested that the war between Japan and the United States in the 1940s was marked with racism, certainly at the front lines and parts of it. He talked about it. Is there a racial issue here that prevents Beijing from trusting the United States and vice versa, or is it more of a cultural?
Interesting. I think, look, racism has been used for worse, not for better, for worse in lots of cases. I mean, there was racism against Germans on the part of Americans in World War I and World War II. But you're right, there seems to have been, at least in World War II, a different sort of, a more insidious form of racism. And, it's definitely part of the debate. Yeah, I mean, it's an important part of the debate. And, there's also the whole Graham Allison Thucydides trap, rising powers, are destined to fight with existing powers aspect of it. I mean, look, there's a strong economic and strategic battle going on here that I think is actually more powerful than the racial aspect or the cultural aspect. And I don't quite know what to do with that. I don't think that we're destined for war, but we're not on a good trajectory right now.
President Nixon, he reopened diplomatic relations between the United States and Beijing. Considering what's going on today with China, was it a mistake?
No, absolutely not. And I think, few people other than Nixon could have done it. He was absolutely right to do it. I think he was quite clear-headed about it. And he recognized, I mean, I think he had great affection for China, but he also recognized that as the leader of the United States, he represented U.S. interests, that there was a matter of interests, not of friendship. And I think it is in the U.S. interest to have diplomatic relations with all countries, but above all with the most populous country in the world.
Let's talk about the media these days. Since a lot of your book is about Jimmy Lai, you talk about that. What sort of restrictions are on local media outlets these days in Hong Kong? For example, I mean, is the South China Morning Post censored?
Hmm. I don't know if it's censored because I don't work there anymore, but its coverage certainly is much narrower than it used to be. Well, the first restrictions on media is that a lot of them have been closed, either closed because the government put us out of business, as it did with AppleDaily when they sent 500 police in and treated our newsroom like it was a crime scene and, incarcerated 7 of the senior staff. That kind of gave the rest of the media a message, and a number of them shut down. The rest of them are just, really, really cautious. And I feel that in both the South China Morning Post and the Standard, the 2 English language papers, it's a much narrower range of coverage, and they're much less likely to do kind of what we call enterprise reporting, go out and do it themselves, whereas they will react to other things. If the government, for example, attacks the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, they'll report on that. But if we just came out with a statement, they won't report on it. So is that censorship? Yeah, I mean, it is. It's, is it censorship because some guy in Beijing is saying, do this, don't do that? No, I think it's a lot more subtle than that.
Gotcha. Talk about Jimmy Lai. Who is it?
Jimmy Lai's a remarkable guy who who's from a formerly wealthy family that lost everything in the communist revolution. His father left for Hong Kong. He came to Hong Kong alone as a 12-year-old penniless immigrant, worked his way up from a factory floor to owning a factory, and started not 1, not 2, but 3 really successful businesses. First, one of the largest sweater manufacturers in Hong Kong, revolutionized fashion. Really, was selling to companies like the Limited, J.C. Penney, Polo. And air shipping things at a time when others were sending them on boats. Innovative forms of manufacturing and dyeing that dramatically shrunk shipment times. Then he got bored with manufacturing. He set up a retailer, which became kind of the father of fast fashion. Japanese guy Tadashi Yanai, who started the unbelievably successful Uniqlo clothing chain, and the last time I looked was the richest guy in Japan by a long shot, $35 billion or something, according to Forbes. He came to Jimmy. Jimmy was his mentor. I mean, Jimmy taught a whole generation of fashion and retail people like how to do things. Very, very innovative, creative entrepreneur, one of the best of his generation. And after the Tiananmen killings in June 1989, when Chinese authorities killed hundreds, maybe thousands of students and protesters in Beijing and around the country, Jimmy got so mad. He believed in China so much. He was one of these Chinese who was so proud to be Chinese, so happy to see the economic reforms that were coming in China, just really believed in it. And when he saw, kids being, gunned down in the streets, kids that he had supported he sent tents up, he sold T-shirts to raise money for them. I mean, he just really believed that Hong Kong and China were on this democratic path. And after those killings, he actually had been planning to go into the fast food, into the restaurant business. He's gotten bored with retailing T-shirts and polo shirts. And so he started a magazine, Next Magazine, and then he started this newspaper. And so he, you take a guy who's one of the, this creative, unbelievably creative, successful entrepreneur who'd come up from absolutely nothing. And you put his energy into media. And he initially, was very much anti-corruption, pro-democracy, but it was anti-corruption. It was a mixture of kind of, titillating, tabloid style journalism with, much harder hitting, more crusading journalism. And as the years went on, he became more and more a leader for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And, ultimately the government just couldn't take it anymore and shut the newspaper and threw him in jail.
Gotcha. How big was his? I think one of the things that people don't understand in the United States is how big was his profile? Locally,
well, I mean, in Hong Kong, yeah, I mean, in Hong Kong, you just had to say Jimmy, and people knew who he was. I mean, even in Chinese, people would just say Jimmy. I mean, he was, pretty much one of the most famous people in Hong Kong and in media, really throughout Asia. I mean, nobody did what he did, and he helped journalists around the region with, support, financial and otherwise. And as I say, it was also he is a devout Catholic. I think this is one of the things that's made him so strong and free, even in prison. And he personally donated, as far as I can tell, well over $100 million, probably closer to $150 million on pro-democracy causes. So he was largely or substantially financing a lot of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong from his own funds, not from corporate funds or anything. So he's a guy who really, really larger than life figure, put his money where his mouth was.
When the AppleDaily was shut down, you talked about the fact that 6 of your colleagues were arrested and taken away, held in jail. What happened to the staff at the paper?
I just disbanded. I mean, it was supremely, it was really sad as a director because our bank accounts were frozen. That's basically, besides sending the police in, that's what really got us. We couldn't, we had plenty of money, but we couldn't even use that to pay staff. So I think they've been fighting with us. Or not fighting with us. They've been trying to get the money, for their last payment. I think they became baristas, taxi drivers. They emigrated. I mean, they weren't working in journalism for the most part anymore. And because they'd worked at Apple, a lot of papers, a lot of publications in Hong Kong didn't want anything to do with them.
You mentioned in your book that Beijing couldn't control JimmyLai. Explain that.
Well, most people would have gotten the message that if the Chinese foreign ministry is attacking you by name, as they did after he met with Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, and they're calling you a black hand, which is kind of a slur in Chinese political terms. So they're calling you the leader of a new gang of four. Very ironic because it was Mao's wife during the Cultural Revolution who was locking people up who was part of the gang of four. When the Chinese government is personally attacking you and you're in their sights, you're in trouble, right? If you care about your freedom. He could have left. He, before this all started, he was a billionaire. Again, according to Forbes, he had residences in Taipei, Kyoto, Paris, London. I mean, he's a British citizen. He could have left, right? And he just kept going. And he said, "I'm a troublemaker." That's what he's told me. After the national security law came in 2020, he started a series of weekly kind of fireside chats with the Hong Kong people. I was the moderator for most of those 15 or 20 chats, and he just kept going. I mean, he just wouldn't shut up. And it takes a lot of guts because he knew where it was going. And he said that he told associates who tried to get him to leave, he said, "Look, I'd rather be hanging from a lamppost in central Hong Kong than give the communists the satisfaction of saying I ran away." He said this in so many different ways. He said, "I'm the captain of a ship. I can't just leave. These are my people. Hong Kong gave me everything. I can't leave it." And yet he also couldn't be quiet just because that's not who he is. So very poignant. It's tragic in the sense that it's his character. It's his nature. I mean, as he said, I'm a troublemaker. And that's fine if you're living in America. it's not really fine if you're living in a totalitarian state. And I think the tragedy is we could see his character, and his character wasn't going to change. And it's his character against Xi Jinping's character now. And Xi Jinping wasn't on the scene when Jimmy started these publications, but we could see the collision of these two strong personalities. And one of them has a state with a powerful security apparatus behind it that can just throw somebody that doesn't like in jail. And the tragedy is that Jimmy's character led him to confront Xi Jinping in that state apparatus.
So
I'd say it's a tragedy. I say it's a tragedy, but I should also say, don't think that Jimmy Lai is rotting in jail. Jimmy Lai is probably freer than he's ever been, from what I hear. I can't be in direct contact with him, but um, as I've said several times, he's Catholic. He has an enormous amount of faith, and he spends his time praying, drawing religious pictures, reading theological texts, and doing forced prison labor for a few cents an hour. But he feels free. He feels like he knows why he's there. And he and Natan Sharansky, the former Soviet refusenik who was 9 years in the Soviet Gulag, had a conversation shortly before Jimmy went to jail. And I've talked with Sharansky. I moderated that conversation, didn't say much, because Jimmy just peppering Sharansky with, like, how do I become the best political prisoner I can? I mean, it's very, very touching, because he knew that he wasn't long for the free world. And I've talked to Sharansky since then. They had a few other conversations, and Sharansky just said it's remarkable. He's never met somebody like this who was embracing his fate. You know, so I say it's a tragedy, but it's a tragedy kind of in that classical sense of your fate, your character up against something that's larger than you is leading you to this result.
is it personal? Well, question here. So it sounds like from what you're describing here with Jimmy Lai, he's sort of egging on the Chinese state to go put him into jail. Is that a correct observation here?
I don't think egging on is the way to think about it. I would think of it in a more positive sense. Chinese people deserve to be free. All people deserve to be free. The Chinese promised the people of Hong Kong freedom, and he's going to work with other freedom-loving people in Hong Kong. So I don't think it's egging on. I do think, as I said, they couldn't shut him up. You know, so is that egging on, or is that just exercising the freedoms that you were promised? I don't think he saw it as egging on or goading, but his character, he's a very blunt, outspoken person. But I don't think there's anything personal where he's egging on Xi Jinping or the Chinese and saying, "Come arrest me." He's just saying, "I am who I am, and I'm not going to change."
Does Xi Jinping have any personal interest in making sure that Jimmy Lai is in prison?
I don't know. It'd be a good question. You know, most decisions tend to go to the top in China these days. According to the Wall Street Journal, when they did an after-the-fact analysis of two Michaels, two Canadians who were held basically as hostage. They were kidnapped after a Chinese executive, Meng Wanzhou, from the Huawei telecoms company was detained in Canada. Xi Jinping apparently gave instructions on almost 100 different occasions about the negotiations to get Meng back to China and the two Michaels back to Canada. So I think Jimmy Lai's freedom is going to run through Xi Jinping's office. Does Xi Jinping personally have anything against Jimmy? Hard to say. I don't know. There are a lot of people that Xi Jinping is jailed, so I don't know if it's personal in every case.
Are there still Western media outlets? I mean, I noticed the Toronto Globe and Mail certainly reporting there. Obviously, you know, you see stories in the Wall Street Journal and certainly the New York Times too as well. You know, reporting out of Hong Kong and out of China. But if Western media outlets leave Hong Kong, does that have any impact on Hong Kong as a financial center?
Sure. I mean, it has impact. You know, I think the less Hong Kong is covered, the worse off we all are, just as with China. I mean, you know, or a place like North Korea. We don't know what's going on in North Korea because we don't have Reuters or Associated Press or UPI or anybody there. So and look, I think the bigger issue is that financial centers rely on a free flow of information. I mean, for price discovery, you need to know what's going on, and if information is shut down, whether or not, I mean, Reuters is there, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Agence France Presse. I mean, lots of people are still in Hong Kong, but if their sources won't talk to them, if information isn't available, I was at something this morning where a guy from the International Energy Agency was talking, who used to cover China, was talking about how difficult it is to get what used to be very routine data about natural gas, oil, and things like that, energy use and consumption out of China. If Hong Kong looks like it's going the way of China, continues to crimp information, then that's really bad for its future as a financial center or as an engine of economic growth.
Can Singapore and China, I mean, do they become, if you're going to leave Hong Kong as a financial center, if you're going to pack up because you're a bank, you do investing, what have you, do Singapore and Japan come up as places to be? Do you go there, and can those places effectively compete to house those kind of entities?
Yeah, and it's a great question. It's the kind of $64 trillion question, I guess. It does seem like Japan is kind of on the way back as an economy. Is it an international center in the way that Hong Kong was? I don't think it ever will be. I mean, Hong Kong, given that the English language ability and the legacy of rule of law, common law, British style administration, government, just had advantages that really almost nowhere else in the region has, except for Singapore. I don't know. Singapore is a small place. It doesn't seem to have gotten the kind of traction as a place to raise international capital in the way that Hong Kong had. It has had a lot of success in terms of wealth management, in terms of getting wealthy families to set up their offices in Singapore. So I do think there's a joke that it took a anyway, Singapore has become very Chinese very, very quickly, and that's for better and for worse. There's a huge money laundering scandal going on right now. There's a lot of mainland money washing in, but it doesn't seem to be in the kind of capital raising aspect that we saw in Hong Kong. What I wonder, though, the bigger question is, if we're kind of decoupling, and that's a loaded phrase, I know, but if we're kind of not as economically engaged, or this isn't becoming a tighter economic engagement between the US and other free countries and China, is there the same need to raise money? Are Chinese companies going to raise money on the international capital markets? And I think that's perhaps the way to think of the question, rather than, oh, are Singapore and Tokyo just going to take over? I wonder if there's actually just going to be less growth and maybe even shrinkage.
And for Chinese companies in this case?
Yeah, because they're being discouraged. They used to come and raise money on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, or they would raise money in Hong Kong to get international capital. They've really pulled back. And I think it's partly reluctance on the part of international investors. And some of these issues in Hong Kong obviously play into it. But I think it's more that they're being discouraged by their own government from going abroad to raise money. For example, there was a ride-sharing company, kind of like Uber, called Didi. Didi raised money in New York and immediately got slapped. Well, it defied warnings by regulators in China, raised the money anyway, got slapped down, and had to delist from its U.S. exchange. So that was a pretty clear warning. Alibaba, which owns the South China Morning Post, in fact, has really had its wings clipped in recent years. So I think Chinese companies are just going to be more internally focused for their capital needs as well as for their business activities. And so that's just bad news for anybody in international capital markets who was counting on a flood of Chinese companies coming that they could IPO or raise capital or bonds for.
But isn't in the long run, or the short run at least, isn't that worse for those Chinese companies than it is for anybody else?
Yeah, but I don't think the Chinese government really cares. I mean, they've wrecked their tech companies in many senses. They've destroyed educational companies. I mean, they've shown, we used to think that they were quite pragmatic, and they've shown again and again that everything takes second place to national security. And again, we used to think they were really pragmatic and they wanted economic growth to bring people out of poverty, of which they just had an extraordinary legacy and success. And yet they've shown that national security trumps all. And this gets back to one of your earlier questions about their sense of shame or of humiliation, or what they suffered in the 19th century, goading them on. And as I said, there's going to be a positive side to that, but I think we're really seeing the negative side now, which is they just see enemies everywhere. They see the world out to hold them back and to keep them down. And I can just assure you that was the farthest thing from U.S. policymakers' minds in the late 20th century, the 1990s, probably until at least 2008. Now, of course, things have changed, but so China's in this self-fulfilling prophecy where they see enemies everywhere, so their their companies shouldn't list abroad, and then, as you say, they end up hurting themselves. They pay more for capital, or they don't get capital.
What about TikTok? TikTok is in the news these days, left and right. You can't seem to turn on the news without hearing about TikTok. What is your thought about TikTok these days?
I think it's really bad for somebody who's that popular and pervasive in our country to be controlled by a foreign government, and to have an algorithm which is, as researchers have shown, which is steering us in different directions. It's basically being weaponized. So, for example, if you use TikTok to talk about Hong Kong freedom issues, you're not going to get very far. If you use TikTok to talk about Uyghur issues, where the incarceration camps in the Xinjiang region of China with Muslims, that's almost absent on TikTok. So the algorithm squelches areas that Chinese don't want discussed and dials up areas that it does. Actually, we've seen how this was weaponized in the last couple of weeks when TikTok told its creators to flood Washington with calls, and their legislators heard loud and clear. And I think that shows you the way that, again, that this technology can be weaponized. Now, I think there's a legitimate debate. A lot of people say, yeah, TikTok, but what about, Facebook or others? And that's a legitimate debate, but one is controlled by an adversarial government and the other ones are not. So I think it's a pretty big difference.
Sure. Do you think TikTok should be illegal in the United States?
I don't think it should be legal. I think it should be divested and it shouldn't be owned or controlled by the Chinese government.
But that's probably not going to happen, right?
Well, it could. I mean, it'd be quite easy to divest. I mean, companies have to divest things all the time. Question is, would the Chinese government allow that to happen? And if it wouldn't, well, that tells you something, doesn't it? It tells you that they control it.
Right. If China successfully takes over Taiwan, what happens? Are there going to be executions? What goes on? Any idea?
No, I think it's obviously going to be very bad. And they're going to be dead people. Are they going to be shot through the head or die some other way? I don't know. But I think it would be a really bad sign for freedom everywhere. And I think just we've obviously seen Putin's aggression. It's his war in the Ukraine, and I think that Xi Jinping and Putin are kind of working on parallel tracks. And I think we had a great heyday of democracy 30 years ago. I'd never thought I'd see the Berlin Wall fall in my lifetime, and we just saw an incredible expansion of freedom. And now we're seeing the tide moving the other way. And I think it's really important for us to stand with the people of Hong Kong and to stand with the people of Taiwan. We have to remember that deterrence has worked. You asked before, we discussed Richard Nixon and his legacy. And one legacy of that was that when normalization between the United States and the People's Republic of China came in 1979, we kind of Washington, or the administration sort of washed its hands of Taiwan. And it was Congress that insisted that the US continue trying to protect and defend Taiwan. And that deterrence has been a remarkable success over the last 45 years. And I think we have to continue with that deterrence. And we have to continue in seeing that the Taiwanese people have the means to defend themselves. And we have to let Beijing know that there's going to be a very, very, very high cost if they try to take the island. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the people of Taiwan and the people of the free world to continue standing strong to ensure that there aren't executions, that it doesn't come to what you mentioned.
Is it critical that Taiwan remain outside of Beijing's grasp?
Well, I think there are a couple ways of answering that. One way would be strategically, and I do think it is important as an American, and for America and for people who love freedom, that Taiwan stays free from a strategic standpoint. But I also think from a moral standpoint, I mean, just as we wouldn't want the people of California, the 40 million people or so in California, to be swallowed up by the People's Republic of China. I mean, I kind of feel the same way about the people of Taiwan. I mean, these are people who fought, against actually a really authoritarian government. After the civil war in China, the nationalists lost and retreated to Taiwan. they were, they weren't really nice people. I mean, they were really, really tough couple of decades. And I know many of those people who fought hard for their freedom and for their democracy. And Taiwan, it matters for those 20, 25 million people, for their sense of freedom, their autonomy, their moral right to be free. But it does also have larger strategic consequences for all of us who care about freedom. And as I said with Hong Kong, you started off, why should we care about a little place of 7.5 million people? But, if a totalitarian government can roll up Hong Kong and then it rolls up Taiwan, I mean, who's next? And that's why Japan is starting to rearm itself, because it doesn't want to be next.
Last question here. What does it signal to the world if Beijing were to successfully take over Taiwan? How will the United States and its allies, how will they all be viewed?
Well, I think if they were able to successfully take over, it would be just a terribly dark day for democracy. It would basically show freedom on the retreat. It would show that a totalitarian resurgent China could start imposing its will on the rest of the world with incalculable consequences in terms of the loss of freedom, the loss of all of us to just live our free lives. I mean, I think it would be just terrible, terrible tragedy, and a betrayal of all the people, especially all the Chinese in Taiwan who fought for democracy and fought for freedom. And Jimmy Lai, by the way, after Hong Kong, then set up a newspaper and a magazine in Taiwan and had enormous success there, and thought that Taiwan would be a springboard to the mainland, that his Taiwan media would then go into the mainland and we'd have a free China. And I still hope to live long enough to I hope he lives long enough to see that dream realized. I mean, I don't think it's not a foregone conclusion that China is going to take over Taiwan. I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that we do have a freer, more open China in the not impossible to predict future. Nobody saw the Berlin Wall falling and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism. I'm not predicting that. I'm a historian. I don't predict, but I think there are enormous weaknesses within China, within the society, within the political structure, and above all, in the economy, that may see things play out quite differently in the next few years than we imagine. Sitting here today, looking at Putin's success, or at least his invasion of Ukraine, looking at Xi Jinping's seeming success in wrecking Hong Kong. So the story is not over yet.
Well, and you mentioned that, too, as well, about the economic issues, and certainly the real estate has been a big part of that story in China too, as well. And some of the, I guess, reading between the lines seems to be that Xi Jinping has a lot of things to think about, including an economy that might go south, and that either helps him maintain the peace or he goes to war. I mean, it seems like it's one or the other. It's A or B. I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, I don't think that a weakening economy is going to provoke Xi Jinping to go to war. I think, when China is weak, it usually tends to focus historically, it usually tends to focus more internally. I think, China's gone through a very, very unusual 75 years. It does go through expansionary periods. I mean, the Chinese state is vastly larger than it was 2,000 years ago. It tends to expand more than it contracts, but I don't think, I mean, the economy is definitely weakening. I mean, not only are the days of 10% growth over, I think the days of 6% growth are over. I think China is going to be growing kind of at 2 or 3% a year if we look over the next 10 or 15 years. I mean, demographically and in many other ways, productivity, the amount of output they're getting from each additional dollar they invest, all the signs are pointing to weakening in the Chinese economy. And I think they'll have their hands full at home. And I actually think that if we can keep deterrence up, ensure that Xi Jinping knows he's going to pay a very, very high price that may result in the end of the Chinese Communist Party if he invades Taiwan, that he's going to think twice. And I think that's, we don't know what's going to happen, but I don't think war is inevitable. I also don't think it's imminent. I mean, I'm very much in sync with the thinking of the Biden administration, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I mean, you need to keep making the Chinese understand that resolve in the free world, including Japan, is very, very high to defend any kind of assault on Taiwan.
Is Xi Jinping vulnerable to being replaced if the economy in China doesn't grow or it goes south? I mean, could the higher ups there in the Communist Party decide he's just not the guy to lead the country right now?
I think that's unlikely. We don't see any signs of that right now. I mean, anything is theoretically possible in an authoritarian government. He's, I suppose, if he had a health issue or something, he could be sidelined. But I mean, all signs suggest that he's at least as strong as any leader since Mao, and maybe in some ways more capable and stronger than Mao himself in terms of wielding power and control over the government and over society.
Well, Mark, thank you so very, very much for your time today. It was a pleasure to have you here and get your views. Very much appreciate them, and certainly hope that you'll come back at some point too as well to talk to us.
I'd love to. Thanks so much, Doug. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, an old Hong Konger, and we live near each other, familiar with the same schools, and hope we can stay in touch.
Absolutely. Well, thank